Greetings, Cheapskate Nation. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. Today, we're on back with another episode of Cheap Shots, the ultimate series for miniature wargamers who want stunning tabletop quality miniatures without breaking the bank. In this series, we'll show you how to save money on your miniature painting hobby by using affordable craft paints, budget-friendly tools, and clever techniques. So whether you're a beginner or a seasoned hobbyist, you'll learn how to achieve incredible results without the premium price tag. And on today's video, we're going to show you guys how to paint up your warband of Gryselle's Arenai for your games of Warhammer Underworlds. This is a Daughter of Cain warband, very much modeled after the old Sisters of Slaughter from Games Workshop's Warhammer Fantasy of old. And as you can see here, this is the exact same result you're going to have with our cheapskate method that we use in order to paint up these miniatures. And by following the tips and techniques that we recommend, we'll save a grand total of $122.93 in order to paint up these 5 miniatures to a wonderful tabletop standard. Now, if you'll notice, the color scheme on these miniatures is quite different than is originally on the box art. And the box art of the original Gryselle's Arenai, they actually have a lot of silver as well as red in the color scheme. But the reason why I've painted up this way with purple and gold is because I want them to fulfill a couple of roles for these miniatures. I want them to be able to match up my Dark Elves army that I have in the studio's collection for Warhammer Fantasy. And at the same time, I'm also using these miniatures for an upcoming Mordheim campaign as well. So we changed up the color scheme just a little bit in order to make that happen. So with that being said, y'all, let's go ahead and talk about exactly how to cheaply paint up Gryselle's Arenai. Now, the first thing you want to do, of course, is to assemble your miniatures and then prime your miniatures as well. We don't need to really worry about basing the miniatures because the base is already sculpted. In fact, much of the miniatures sculptures are actually included into the bases as well. So once you guys have these fully assembled with push fitting, the next thing you gotta do, of course, is prime it. And I like to use Rust-Oleum flat white primer in order to achieve this effect. And the reason why priming is so important is that it fulfills a couple of roles. The first thing that does, it gives a good surface for your acrylic paints to adhere to as you paint your miniatures. Unfortunately, if you were to take your acrylic paints and apply them directly onto bare plastic, the slightest bit of friction could cause the paint to rub off, which will of course ruin the finish of your miniature. So priming kind of solves that problem. Another thing that priming also does as well is it also has a large impact on the vibrancy of the colors of your miniature. Traditionally speaking, the brighter the paint job that you want to do on your miniature, the lighter the primer you want to go with. So in this case, I use bright white primer, and the reason why is because when I do my oil wash, it's going to naturally darken it down with the oil washing stage. So now that we're done with priming, the first thing I do, of course, is to work on the flesh. Now, there is a bit of flesh exposed on these miniatures because, for a couple reasons. One, they are dark elves, and two, they have this very much a gladiatorial look to them, hence the name the Arenai. They're very much modeled after the old Sisters of Slaughter from Warhammer Fantasy from way back in 8th edition. So in order to create some details on the exposed flesh, I like to use Delta Cerancoat's Peaches and Cream. You can get it at your local Hobby Lobby. It's a nice pale flesh color. I use this color because they're supposed to be dark elves, and we like to go with a little bit of a darker, paler look for my dark elves, so I just put 2 thin coats of this on all the exposed flesh on these fighters. So things, for example, like the nape, as well as their chests, their arms, their heads, for example, as well as some of their legs. So just find those details that you want to have colored flesh, put 2 thin layers, and we're ready to move on to the next detail. So the next detail we're working on now is on the clothing these characters are wearing, specifically on the trousers that they're wearing. And they got these kind of neat kind of stocking style pants that they're wearing, kind of like leggings a little bit. So in order to bring out that detail, I put 2 thin coats of Tuscan Teal by Apple Barrel paint. You can get this at your local Walmart and just go do good solid base coat on the trousers you see there. As you can see, like one of the legs is a couple of these fighters have one whole leg that's like one of these stockings, while other ones have like bits of armor panel attached to them, etc. You don't need to be particularly neat at this stage. Just make sure you get a good solid base coat with the Tuscan Teal, and then ready to move on with our dry brushing. So the color we're going to use for the dry brush on the trousers, we're going to use Dutch Aqua by Folk Art. You can get this at your local Walmart. And the reason why we do dry brushing is because dry brushing creates the illusion of depth on our miniatures by creating highlights. What ends up happening is when you dry brush your miniature, the pigments of the paint adhere to the raised surfaces of the miniature while leaving that darker color in the recesses. So it's really good at capturing details like studs that are actually built into the pants these characters are wearing, as well as the folds of the fabric, etc. It creates the illusion of depth on our miniatures. And once you're done with that dry brush, we're ready to move on to our next base coat. So the next color we're going to use, of course, are for the tops that these characters are wearing as well. And I say that kind of loosely because some of these characters are just wearing breastplates with no any kind of undergarments whatsoever. Some characters are wearing like full-blown tunics. Some characters only have loincloths in some situations. So in order to create that look, I decided to pick up that detail in 2 thin coats of Wild Iris by Apple Barrel paint. It's a beautiful dark purple color that also contrasts quite nicely with all the turquoise that we have so far. Actually complements the turquoise that we have. And at the same time, the Wild Iris is also going to contrast nicely with the gold color we're going to use for the armor that we're going to have on these miniatures as well. Now we just put 2 thin coats of this directly on things like the shirts as well as the sashes these characters are wearing, and they're ready to move on to our dry brushing. Alright, so next thing we do of course, is to dry brush the probe that we did earlier, as well as do some base coating on the hair, specifically on Gryselle herself, who's the leader. She's the lady who's carrying that dagger that you see in the center of the photo. She's got really long flowing braids going down her back, so in order to break out that detail, I decided to base coat 2 thin layers of Lilac Mist by Apple paint. It's a beautiful lavender color that you just put 2 thin coats directly onto her locks and just basically paint that up. And once we're done with that, of course, we use the exact same color in order to dry brush all the colors that we did in Wild Iris earlier, so the shirts as well as the sashes, in order to bring out those details like the fold of fabric as well as the texturing of the fabric as well. And once we're done with that, the next thing we're going to start working on are the leather goods. So the next detail we're going to work on next is on the leather goods for these characters, so things like their boots, their belts, any harnesses they manage to have on their bodies, any straps of leather they are wearing, as well as the net of the triari in the background there, the character's carrying a net. Now to use that color, we're going to use Pavement by Apple paint. It's actually not a black color, it's very close to black, but it's actually extremely dark gray. But the reason why I like using Pavement paint is because there's a little bit of a grit texture to this paint, and it does a beautiful job when it comes to dry brushing. So I'm a big fan of this color. So we're just going to look for those details and put 2 thin coats directly on it. Now the thing is, of course, if you do see any white bleeding through the pavement paint, don't stress out about that too much. The reason why is because when we dry brush it with the light gray, it's only going to look like it's part of the detail. And speaking of the light gray, we're going to use Pale Gray by Folk Art. We're going to use this to dry brush all the areas that we just did in leather, all the black that we just did earlier. So things like the netting, for example, the boots, the straps, the belt. We're just going to put a quick dry brush of Pale Gray's, Folk Art's Pale Gray over directly on the parts that we did in black earlier. And as you can see, it does a beautiful job of bringing out those details and also creating highlights on our miniatures as well. Now, if you'll notice, our miniatures are quite chalky in appearance, and the reason why is because that is the side effect of dry brushing. If you're worried about that pastel chalky look, do not worry. When we actually get to the oil washing stage, the oil washing is going to take care of all of that. It's going to bring it to an absolute beautiful finish. So up next, we're going to work on 2 specific fighters in this warband. These are these 2 characters who are armed with shields as well as swords. These 2 fighters have these really ornate looking shields that they have. I guess you would call them bucklers, I guess, because they also have blades attached to them as well. And the reason why we picked these out individually is because what we're going to do is we're going to paint the shields up first, and then we're going to add the accent color directly on top of it later on. So the color we're going to use for this is Gunmetal Gray. It's made by Folk Art. You can get it at your local Walmart for a really low price. It's about 78 cents. And the nice thing about this color, of course, is a beautiful gunmetal color, and it's extremely cheap. So let's put 2 thin coats directly on the shields, and then we're gonna start working on the next detail next with the gold elements. As you can see there, I got a little bit of the gold going on right now with the character there on the right hand side. So the next detail we're going to work on real fast is all the gold elements on these miniatures, and that's because there's quite a bit of them in the paint job that I'm going with on this one. Like I said before, I'm going to try to match this warband with my Dark Elf army that I have for the Studios collection, because I want to use as Sisters of Slaughter in future games of Warhammer Fantasy, or Warhammer the Old World rather. So these characters, of course, there's a lot of gold in my Dark Elf army, so I wanted to include this in their color scheme as well. So we did all the armor panels, things like the tiara that Gryselle is carrying, the hilts of her knife, the armor panels that she has on her body, same thing with all the other characters as well, things like the horns, for example, the pauldrons, the chest plates, the leg greaves and arm greaves, etc. The characters that we did earlier with the shields that we painted completely silver, start picking out those details like the long-tongued skull that's on the shield of the bear right in the front, and same in the back as well. So all the metallic elements that we want to be gold, we just put 2 thin coats of Deco Arts Emperor's Gold. It's a beautiful, rich, dark gold color that you get at your local Walmart. It costs about 98 cents. Now the next part we're going to work on, of course, are on the masks of the characters as well. As you can see in the faceplates, we decided to use Anniversary Silver by Folk Art in order to create this kind of bluish, kind of light silvery color on the masks that these characters are wearing as well. We also use copper in order to bring out some of the copper elements on these characters as well. Things like jewelry that they're wearing, for example. Some of the other iconography that they have on their armor. We just picked those out 2 thin layers of both those colors, and we're going to move on to our very last metallic detail. And that last metallic detail we're going to focus on real fast are on the blades of their weapons. So we're going to finish it up playing it with Gunmetal Gray, like we talked about earlier by Folk Art. So things like the blades of their swords, the hooks and barbs attached to their hair, as well as to their clothing, and any other bladed weaponry that we wanted to be taken out in that gunmetal color. And once we're done with that, the next thing I gotta do now is an oil wash. So for this step, we're using Midwax Polyshade and Mission Oak. We're going to use this directly to act as a wash all over the entirety of the miniatures. And the reason why we're doing that is because this oil wash does a couple of things. The first thing that it does, of course, is that it seeps down directly into the recessed areas in the miniatures and brings a lot of the details we couldn't see earlier. So things, for example, like the individual strands of hair, the texture of the clothing, the gaps in the armor panel, etc. The second thing that the oil wash also does too is it notices and it blends out it removes the chalky appearance of our miniatures because it blends the dry brushing as well as the base coating and kind of blends those two layers together and makes it more of a seamless organic look to it, so it makes it really beautiful. And the second thing, last thing it also does too, is it also darkens down the vibrancy of the colors that we use as well. That value has been darkened, and that's the reason why we use such bright colors in the earlier steps. Now you will need to let this stuff dry and cure for about 24 hours because there is polyurethane inside of it. The nice part about that, of course, is that it will create a protective outer coating to protect your miniatures with a high gloss finish, so that part is quite nice. For those guys most people, when they actually do this kind of stuff, they actually use one of Army Painter's products, which is usually Army Painter Strong Tone in order to do that. The problem though is that Army Painter Strong Tone costs about $30+ a can, while the Minwax Poly Shades in Mission Oak only costs about $6.99 at Walmart. Now what you're going to do is, of course, use this as your very last painting step for the time that you paint, wait 24 hours later, and then come back. Now the next step we're going to work on are on the bases. Now I'm going to be honest with you guys. The bases are very ornate. They have like skulls and bones and pieces of masonry all over the bases. And you could of course take your time and paint those up if you want to. However though, I'm not going to do that just because I was feeling kind of lazy when I was painting these miniatures, and I wanted to match the bases that I have for my Dark Elf army. Now for my Dark Elf army, I do have it look like they're walking out of water because Dark Elves traditionally attack from the sea, kind of like Sea Raiders. So I wanted to create that same look on their bases too. So I just painted the entirety of their bases in two thin coats of bright blue by Appleboro paint. You get it at your local Walmart for a nice cheap price, and it does a beautiful job of making that kind of aqua water look on their bases. So to add a little bit more detail on the bases, I decided to dry brush this with a few coats of Dutch Aqua as well. As you can see, it brings a lot of the details on the bases, especially the texturing. As you can see some of the bone as well as the broken masonry that these characters are standing on as well. And oddly enough, it makes it look like this stuff is actually submerged beneath the water, like they're walking along the coastline in the shallows leading up to their main attack, which is quite nice as well. Now before we move on, of course, I like to do a matte varnish on my miniatures just because I like a finished product. I like a matte varnish on my miniatures to give it more of a matte finish when I paint these guys up. So because of that, this next step is completely optional, but I like to use a Crayon matte varnish. And I spread it all over the miniatures, remove that high gloss sheen that we had earlier from the oil wash as well. And the reason why we did this, of course, is because what I'm going to do next now is I'm going to put a high gloss finish directly on the bases of these characters are standing on to make it look like it's wet and like it's under the water. So that's the reason why I did the matte varnish first, because the next step requires me to use that high gloss finish. So to give that high gloss finish on the bases and make it look like it's water, I like to use a high gloss coating. I like to use Minwax Polyacrylic, which is a clear gloss. Now the polyacrylic clear gloss is exactly the same as the same stuff that we use for the that we did in the miniatures earlier with the oil wash, except this has no pigment on it. It's just a gloss finish on it, and I apply it like a gloss directly on top of the bases as well. And oddly enough, it's about the same price as a pot of Games Workshop Citadel's Ard Coat, except that you get infinitely more because you're actually buying a full 32-ounce can for $7.99 as opposed to like the little pot that you get from Games Workshop. Now you do need to let this stuff dry and cure, and it takes about 24 hours for that to get done, and then once you're done, you're ready to move on to our very last detail. And that last detail, of course, is to rim the bases. For this, I like to use two thin coats of Laguna by Appleboro paint. It's a nice bright teal color that also matches the rest of the Dark Elf army, and with that, our miniatures are now fully completed. And once again, here's the end result of our miniatures that we saw earlier. So as you can see, these miniatures are brought to a beautiful tabletop standard. They look nice and lethal, ready to throw down in the ruins of Mordheim or in your games of Warhammer Underworlds, whatever you want to use them for. I plan on using them for Warhammer Fantasy as well as for Mordheim, but if you play Warhammer Underworlds, then more power to you. So that being said, let's talk about exactly what you're going to need to purchase from Games Workshop if you want to achieve the exact same results we did, but using the name brand paints instead. Alright, so these are the materials that you need to buy from both Citadel as well as Army Painter if you want to achieve the exact same results we did, but using those name brand paints instead. You'll need to buy a can of Corax White Spray, which would cost you $24, as well as the colors Thunderhawk Blue, Nagaroth Night, Temple Guard Blue, Takala Lilac, Teclis Blue, Eshin Gray, Flayed One Flesh, Ulthuan Gray, and all those colors are going to cost you $4.55 a piece. You also need to buy a pot of Lead Belcher, Screaming Bell, Ironbreaker, Aethermatic Blue, as well as Retributor Armor, and all those colors cost you $7.80 for those. You also need to buy a can of Army Painter Strong Tone, which is going to cost you $32 for that product, as well as a pot of Ard Coat if you want to achieve that high gloss finish on the base like we did. That's going to cost you another $7.80, as well as a can of Munitarian Varnish for $24 if you want to get that matte finish on the miniatures. Now, assuming that you're purchasing everything for the very first time from both Citadel as well as Army Painter, you're talking about a grand total investment of $163.20 to paint up your miniatures the same way we did, as opposed to our cheapskate method of only $40.27. And when you subtract the two, you end up with a grand total savings of $122.93. So there you guys have it. If you're looking for a way to save money on the miniatures wargaming hobby, may I suggest switching to cheaper craft paints. After all, you get similar results at a fraction of the price, and at the same time, you can use that money for other things like buying miniatures or just save it if you want. It's entirely up to you. So there you guys have it. That's how you guys can play Gryselle's Arenai for your games of Warhammer Underworlds. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. Your guys' input is invaluable to us as always. I am Commander Cheapskate. I will catch you guys next one. Peace out and stay classy.